Next question. Lord Hunt of King's Heath.
My Lords, I beg leave to ask the question standing my name on the order paper.
My Lords, the Office for Students informed the Department for Education on the 11th of November that it has decided to open an investigation into whether the University of Sussex has met its obligations on academic freedom and freedom of speech. No academic should have to fear for their personal safety, particularly as a consequence of expressing lawful views. This incident demonstrates why this government is pressing ahead with legislation to promote and defend freedom of speech on campuses.
Lord Hunt of King's Heath.
Well, my Lords, I welcome that answer. Professor Stock, a distinguished academic at Sussex University, essentially said your biological sex cannot be changed by feelings of identity. Now, for quite unexceptional remarks, she's been vilified by colleagues, abused by students, unsupported by a union, and really let down by a university who are far too late to defend her. And other academics, my Lords, in many other universities are facing similar abuse, particularly women facing similar abuse for basically gender-critical views. Now, my Lords, the Noble Baroness refers to the forthcoming legislation, but does she agree, however much legislation you have, you need to have confidence in our universities to show some strength in defending their academics? My Lords, what is the government going to do about that?
Well, the Noble Lord is absolutely right to condemn the abuse that many academics, particularly women, have suffered recently. The government is clear that almost any restriction of lawful speech and academic freedom goes against the fundamental principles of English higher education. The new Higher Education Freedom of Speech Bill will strengthen existing freedom of speech duties and will address the gaps that exist within the current law, including the lack of a clear enforcement mechanism, and that will bring with it clear consequences for providers and student unions who breach these new duties.
Lord Watts.
My Lords, the Minister quite rightly says this is a very sensitive area, but no academic should be worried about expressing an opinion, and no academic should actually be fearful of their own well-being. But the government says that it will introduce new legislation. How would it affect this issue if the university fails to act in a proper way?
So, universities have to balance and have had long-standing duties in relation to freedom of speech in law. They have to balance those with their duties under the Equality Act and other bits of legislation. They will be expected to take all reasonable, practicable steps to address any constraints on freedom of speech and uphold that in future.
Lord Harris of Pentragarth.
What happened to Professor Kathleen Stock was very, very deeply dismaying and worrying for our society. Universities should be both a safeguard and a focus of rational debate about contentious issues. I was glad to hear from the Minister that the Office for Students is actually setting up an inquiry, because this is not just a local difficulty, but actually something which is fundamental to the future of a civilised society. Will she actually bring their recommendations to Parliament so we can see that they're going to be adequate in actually strengthening the role of academics for free debate?
Well, the Noble and Right Reverend Prelate makes a good point, and he will have seen, I'm sure, the letter that was written by over 200 academics that was published in the Sunday Times last year, with the point that actually it's junior academics who face the most chilling impacts of what's going on. He will know, of course, that the Office for Students is independent, and therefore it's up to them as to how they present their report, but I'd be happy to answer questions on it should they arise.
Annis Jenkin of Kennington.
My Lords, much of the public discourse of Kathleen Stock's case has focused on free speech and her right to express her views. Not enough has been said about what those views are. As the Noble Lord, Lord Hunt, said, Professor Stock believes that biological sex is binary and immutable, a view held by most people in this country, that it is not transphobic to hold these views and at the same time to believe that we must protect women's rights. Can my noble friend confirm that holding these beliefs is a protected characteristic under the Equality Act 2010, and that it is unlawful for employers, for service providers and for co-workers to discriminate against or harass their employees or customers simply for holding or expressing such beliefs?
Well, I would point my noble friend towards the recent Employment Appeal Tribunal ruling, which held that gender-critical beliefs that do not seek to destroy the rights of trans people can be protected beliefs under the Equality Act. Individuals should not face unlawful discrimination in the workplace for expressing those beliefs within the law.
Baroness Garton of Frognall.
My Lord, universities should be places where unpopular views can be aired, discussed and challenged. Academic freedom, as we've already heard, is of paramount importance. However, does the Minister agree that staff and students should be able to pursue their studies in an atmosphere which is safe and inclusive? There should be no place for the intemperate and divisive language which seems to have been a feature on both sides in this particular sad case.
The noble lady is absolutely right. There should be a safe and inclusive environment, and the right to freedom of speech is not an absolute right, and it certainly does not include the right to incite violence or terrorism or harass others.
Lord Cormack.
No, my lords, that indeed is right, but I associate myself very closely with the remarks of my noble friend Baroness Jenkins of Kennington, but I would ask that the Secretary of State write to all Vice-Chancellors, pointing out that we're on the slippery road to Salem and McCarthy if we continue with this practice on the campuses. Very good.
I'm happy to share my noble friend's suggestion with the Secretary of State, but I know that my noble friend would also support the independence and autonomy of universities, and what the government is seeking to do is make crystal clear their duties in relation to freedom of speech and how those can be enforced.
Baroness Morris of Yardley.
My Lords, one of the most disturbing aspects of what Professor Stock has had to endure is that some academic staff seem to have encouraged students to behave in a way that is quite contrary to the purpose of being at university. If higher education stops being that place for open debate and discussion, we as a nation really do have problems. But sadly, Professor Stock is not the only person in this position, and whilst I welcome the report that she's announced into the University of Sussex, noble members and the Minister will be aware of named people who are going through this as well. What can she do now to make sure that in several weeks' time we are not having a debate about further resignations from university posts?
So the noble Baroness is absolutely right. I think the government has been crystal clear on its view on these issues. We've heard today about the investigation on the part of the Office for Students, which I'm sure will cause other university leaders to reflect, and perhaps your lordships might consider the number of amendments on the bill when it comes to your lordship's house.
Baroness Sherlock.
My Lords, the bill the Minister's just mentioned would propose us to appoint a new free speech director in the Office for Students. For someone to be able to intervene in sensitive areas, it's really important that they have the trust across the sector of all sides. But the Minister will be aware that when the chair was appointed, it did trigger the intervention of the Commissioner for Public Appointments and ended up appointing somebody who still takes the government whip in this House, which I think has caused some concern. So could I just ask her to reassure the House that when they come to appoint a new Chief Executive and this director, that the appointment process will be fair and transparent?
Absolutely reassure the noble lady that the appointment process, like all processes, will follow the public appointments procedures, which I hope will have the confidence of every member of the House.
Cashman.
My Lords, I welcome the investigation announced today, but I want to make a couple of simple points. All trans people, and that include trans women, deserve to be treated with respect, dignity and humanity in their workplace or any other environment. Therefore, does the noble lady, the Minister, agree with the recent Employment Appeal Tribunal that the protection of a gender-critical belief as a philosophical belief does not mean that it is acceptable to misgender trans people, that trans people have lost their Equality Act protections against discrimination and harassment, or that employers and service providers will no longer be able to provide a safe environment for trans people, including trans women?
I would say, in response to the Noble Lords, that reassurances to trans people were clear in the recent Employment Appeal Tribunal ruling, which I referred to in my response to my noble friend Baroness Jenkin, which held that gender-critical beliefs that do not seek to destroy the rights of trans people can be protected under the Equality Act.
My Lords, the time allowed for this question has elapsed. Baroness Thornton.